Hey everyone, welcome back to Lookout. Today we've got something a little different. I had a chance to do a lecture for the Google Earth product team at Google, the folks that built the Google Earth app. Google Earth is the primary tool that I use to create all the 3D maps and display them for you on our live streams. And so it was a treat to get to talk to the folks that developed it. They were interested in how I use it. They're developing a new version of Google Earth, and they want to know what features in the original Google Earth Pro I can't live without. So this is a little more technical than most of our normal talks, but it kind of just goes through kind of the ways that I use GIS mapping data in Google Earth to create the visualizations that we use in our stuff. So check it out. And if you're interested in learning more about Google Earth, I recommend just getting in there and playing with it. Google Earth Pro, you can download it for free. And also, a lot of the data that I talk about using is called GIS data. So if you're interested in learning more about digital mapping, it's pretty technical. It's not really easy to figure out on your own. I recommend taking a class either from a junior college or online. But Geographic Information Systems, GIS, is the kind of background technology we use to create a lot of the products that we share with you guys. So I hope you enjoy this. Thanks.
I think some people on the Earth team might already be familiar with the Lookout. It's an independent media company that reports on wildfire forestry, land management, and rural culture. They're based near the Bay Area office in Chico, not near, but relatively near. And so their mission is to help people understand how wildfires work. And we've been watching some of the videos they put out on their YouTube channel, I think for many years now. We've been looking at this as a really compelling way to use Google Earth to visualize and analyze big data. So I'm really excited that Zeke from the Lookout is here today. He's going to share with us how he uses Google Earth Pro to visualize wildfires and share some of the workflows and challenges that he has, hopefully, with us, because we're really interested to learn about that. When you're importing, managing, visualizing all this big geospatial data in Earth, and kind of how, Zeke, how you use it to present this data to your audience and make it compelling and make it understandable. And Zeke has a background in wildland fire and pre-fire planning. He's been working in this space, I think, since the 90s. So he's really has a lot of expertise on this topic, and I'm excited for you to share. So Zeke, I think I will turn it over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. How many of you work on Google Earth Pro on developing it or supporting it or otherwise? All right,
I think
I see the thumbs jumping up. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I couldn't do my job without it, and I love you all. I've been using Google Earth since it was Keyhole, basically, and I have these nightmares that one day I'll wake up and it won't be supported anymore, and then I'll have to use an Esri product or something, and I'd rather die. So I appreciate all the work that you guys have done to make it, and so I'm going to talk about a couple of the fires that I've reported on in the last couple of years. The Lookout is not watch duty. We're not. Our job isn't to tell everyone about every single fire, but I've been working in fire management for about 30 years, and we definitely have kind of an agenda with the Lookout, which is to help tell a more nuanced story about wildfire management and about kind of the natural ecology of wildfire, and to kind of break free of traditional media narratives around wildfire. And we like to say that there's kind of, you only need three things for a script for a wildfire news story. You've got your victims, which are the homeowners. You've got the heroes, which are the firefighters. And you've got the villain, which is the fire. And so traditional media has followed that script on almost every fire to the point where it's just kind of tedious and nerve-wracking for most people to watch media coverage of wildfire, especially when they're affected by it. If they're evacuated from their home or anything else, there's this real sensationalized and kind of simplified plot, and there's an appetite for a more nuanced story. So what we do with the Lookout is we try to tell stories that, I started working in wildfire in 1995, And then I got into doing GIS in college around the same time. And then those two worlds kind of collided. The fire world, I worked on a fire crew and on a forestry crew, and those worlds kind of, the GIS and fire worlds kind of collided in the late 90s when we started taking plotters and computers to fire camps and making the maps. Before that, they just would take a big kind of photocopied stack of topo maps and they would draw on them with a Sharpie. And there was actually a position on the fire for the person that copied the map by hand. And so it was kind of revolutionary to start, using ArcView 3.2 to put colored lines on a topo in the fire camp and then actually plot. So I worked for a contractor doing that for 10 years, and then I started my own company, and we did the same work. So I've worked in the planning section on about 250 of the largest fires kind of in the past 2 decades in California. And in the planning section, our job is to kind of figure out what's going on. And specifically within the planning section, there's a situation unit, and that's basically the intelligence function of the team, where we gather all the geospatial intel. We have field observers working for us. We've got infrared overflights that happen every night. In the early days, we just had these real simple Garmin GPS units. There was no cell connectivity. We'd send field observers out to the fire. They would walk the fire. They would drive it. They would fly it in a helicopter or whatever, and they'd bring us back a perimeter. And we would make the daily perimeter out of that, and then we'd publish all of our map products. And so the fire world's been kind of slow to evolve with geospatial technologies. There's this reluctance to rely too much on anything that could fail because everything's mission critical. And frankly, there hasn't been the money there in wildfire to support the big players in military technology getting into wildfire until really recently. So there wasn't, the whole wildfire budget 10 years ago was like $2 billion a year. And so the big players like Northrop Grumman or Raytheon or the other people that make a lot of money off of mapping technology in the military, there just wasn't the money for them to play. Lately, there's a lot more money pouring into wildfire, and so now we've got more military-type tools like kind of real-time infrared mapping. And so it's been a fun time to kind of transition from being in fire camps to being in storytelling, because I spent the 20 years in the fire camps in the kind of workflow, so I know where to look for the online intel that is open source. And so the lookout is all open source intel. We don't really have access to any data that's not available to other people. So I'll just share my screen. We'll talk about the Palisades fire in SoCal. I'll show you how I gathered intel and used the tools. And then I'm also going to look at kind of more of a large-scale forest fire that was burning in the backcountry in Northern California and show you how we kind of told that story. So does anyone have any questions just kind of on what I've talked about before I jump into kind of the live action?
Yes, I've got a question. Do you have a sense ahead of time of the type of story you want to tell for a given fire? Or, you're clearly offering an alternative view from the, public media, but do you have a sense of this, the way I would like to get this story presented? Yeah.
So I'll use these stories. I'll use these next two fires as kind of examples of the storytelling opportunities that emerge from them, and then maybe how I orient myself editorially based on my background and the information that I like, how I use Google Earth to help steer my coverage. Okay, first of all, I've got a space mouse that I love. When I first started doing this, people commented that my navigation was really jerky, and so a friend of mine gave me a space mouse. Okay, so things I love about Google Earth Pro. I love that I can load in really big data sets. I've got a California fire history layer here that's got maybe 25,000 polygons. They're colored by decade. I love in Google Earth that I can export a symbolized shapefile from QGIS as a KML. I use QGIS a lot on my back end. And here I've created and simplified a data set. This data set from the Forest Service is updated annually, and it's got a ton of vertices and it's got too much information. So I simplify it in QGIS to maybe 50 meter vertices, because at the scale I don't need to see every little nook and cranny. One of the problems with the more detailed mapping we're getting now is that like this is the Dixie Fire out here, and the Dixie Fire literally broke KML because they were using kind of automated mapping from the infrared, and they had way too many vertices. And so like early on, it actually broke the kind of geodatabase too for Esri. And no one who was kind of working on the back end realized that and like simplified the polygon. And so we had a lot of problems just like grabbing their data, and it's like, oh, it won't fill in KML. Why is that? Oh, it's because it's exceeding the kind of vertex limit. Anyway, I symbolize these things by decade in QGIS, and then I can export a KML and have them as subfolders, and so I can turn them on and off individually. What I love about Google Earth Pro also is I can like come in here and I can symbolize everything in this folder. I can say like, oh, I want to change all the fires from the 1930s as a batch to have a red outline or something like that. That's important to me. Symbology, being able to symbolize individual KML but also folders and groups of features is important, and that's something you can't do right now in the web version. So I'll look at a map like this, and I'll say like, hey, there's a fire taking off in Orleans. How many fires have we had in this area in the last 50 years? Maybe there's a fire that starts right out here, and there's been fires all around it in the past. Here's 2017, here's 2021, here's 2014, 2006. So I can know right off the bat that like, hey, this fire is not going to be a mega fire. It's not going to be the next Dixie Fire, because all the area around it, the fuels are reduced by recent wildfires. And so that's one of the big stories we like to tell, is that the wildfire history tells you a lot about the potential for any given fire. So here's another visualization where I've taken all those fire history layers and I've overlapped them and counted the overlaps. And so I can look at the same area and I can say like, hey, there's places here in the Salmon River that have burned 5 times in the last 100 years. This place has burned 5 times. This has burned once. And so if I have a fire that's starting out here, I know like, hey, it's burning in heavy fuels in an area that's way out of its natural fire regime because of lightning and native people starting fires here. We should have had 6 or 7 or 8 fires in recorded last 100 years, but we haven't. So therefore the fire is likely to be more destructive but it's also likely to not grow super large because it's surrounded by other fires that have happened in the last couple decades, right? This area burned 4 years ago. This area burned 10 years ago. So that's one of the stories we're trying to tell at the landscape scale, is how fire history affects the potential outcome. So like I grew up here right in Lassen County, which is kind of northeastern California. And this is the Dixie Fire here that burned 1 million acres. And if you look at pre-Dixie Fire, what you see is that there hadn't been any really large fires in this area where the Dixie really had its big growth for the last 100 years. And so what's interesting about this fire history map to me is like areas that haven't had large fires, like the whole Yuba River watershed hasn't had a large fire for a really long time. And so another thing that I use a lot in kind of trying to inform myself on where, sorry, I gotta pull up a different window here. I use Copernicus a lot, which is Sentinel imagery from the European Space Agency. They've got this great viewer, and I can come in here and I can visualize. I can get a new 10-meter run every 5 days. I can kick it out as a KML and bring it straight into Google Earth. And so this area that I was just pointing at in the Yuba River, like if you look at the NDVI, which is vegetation vigor, basically, you see that there's this huge area of dark green. That's heavy forest. You look north of there, and it's like there's a ton of light green because that areas have burned a lot. And so if we see there's new fire starting in the Yuba, we're like, hey, this has potential, if we're in a drought, to be the next Dixie Fire because we haven't had fires there for a long time. So that's basically how I orient myself as a geographer, as a pyrogeographer, is I'm interested in what the fire history has been, what the fire history should have been if we would have had native burning and lightning ignitions, and how that stacks up to hazard. So another way that I inform myself there is I use a program called CalTopo. CalTopo is a really nice web-based map creation tool that you can pay for pro version. And they've got this thing that they call their super overlay, where if you remember, you can download a KMZ, and then it has all these layers here. It has scan topos, and they're all basically like WMS services. And so I can turn on structures in there and overlay them in Google Earth. And so I can see like, hey, here are all these places in the foothills that have like concentrated population. And then there's these places that don't. And so the places that have concentrated population obviously have a different kind of politics around fire. They have a different kind of level of fear from the people that live there versus places out in the middle of nowhere. So if there's a fire burning way out in the middle of nowhere, no structures around, we might want to tell the story that, hey, this fire is doing a lot of good work. And, you know, one of our agendas basically is to try to get the population and policymakers to a point where we're willing to let some wildfires burn for resource benefit. And in the past, the Forest Service has done that. There's a long history of the last, 60 years of how the agencies have let some fires burn. Really politically fraught topic, but incredibly, spatially explicit. And so all these conversations we have around something like wildfire really are best suited to happen in a very spatially explicit context. Because as soon as we start talking about fire out of its kind of geographic context, we get into the politics of like, they're not logging enough, they're logging too much. We need more vegetation management. We need to rake the forest. And it's like, well, yes, some places we need more fire, some places we need less fire, some places we need more vegetation management. Some places the logging history affects the fire hazard in negative ways. Some places the logging history creates forest structures that are more suited to fire. The whole world of forestry is this incredibly complex but always spatially explicit field of study. So location matters more than anything in talking about wildfire. And so trying to create a spatial context for people, we feel like there's an overload of information when it comes to wildfire and an underload of context. People are really lacking that. So that's one of the ways that we like to use Google Earth is to kind of help people. I've built my understanding of the spatial context of wildfire using Google Earth, using Landsat, using like all the tools of a geographer for the last 30 years. And so our mission is to use the tools of the geographer to educate the public and to increase the public literacy of kind of the spatial nature of wildfire and forestry. So to that end, I'm going to talk a little bit about so we pick fires that we think are interesting. If there's a fire in Riverside County and it's burning 100 acres of brush, there might not really be anything that interesting that fits kind of into our agenda or our mission, which is fire literacy. It's like, oh, it's just another fire burning out in the brush. Not every fire's, yeah.
Sorry, I've had a question that you're trying to get away from the background of this, but earlier you were showing fire history, and I was curious to know if the recency of the fire, how much it matters. Clearly, if a place had burned 5 times, but they were 40 years ago, that's very different than a place that has burned once,
right?
Say, 3 years ago. Does burning twice make a big difference versus just burning once recently? I don't know about fires, how much is left behind. So, and obviously the natural conclusion is to come up with a layer that shows just sort of, fire risk, right? If it started burning now, how much fuel is there based on the history.
Yeah, there's a lot of great work that's kind of done on that already. So, fire perimeter only tells you so much. Like if we look at this area here that burned in 2023, if we look at the actual perimeter of the fire, we got the perimeter here in red, and then we've got so this area all burned. We can say it burned, but we can't really say much more than that. We can say like, this was the final perimeter of the fire, but when you look at the actual severity, that tells you more about the kind of lasting ecological effects. So I like to use sentinel imagery to get at the severity, because it's kind of, it makes for an interesting visual representation of how hot the fire burned. And then the patterns in which, and so back to the technical side, this is just a KML that I can load in, and I'll load a bunch of them in. Like, basically you can only export like a little bit at a time of them from Copernicus. And so I'll create like an overlay where I'll have a folder that maybe has like 15 individual KMZs in it. And then I can turn it on. I can kind of adjust the transparency. But what I like to do then is say, like, this severity pattern tells a story of how the fire unfolded. Like, these areas that are bright red burned in a matter of a couple days of kind of strong north winds with dry conditions. But then these areas that burned in green are just kind of what we'd call underburning, where in some cases it was because the firefighters lit backfires off of these road systems. So in the Sentinel, I can actually see like, hey, this is a backfire that was lit off this ridge that we've been watching them kind of prepare for a week. So there's a lot that goes on with like how these fires get fought, that unfolds over time in a really choreographed fashion. And those are the stories we like telling. So like, hey, earlier in this fire, if we look at the perimeter, we can watch it unfold, and we can kind of talk about, hey, this is what we think is going to happen. And then, so these overlays really help with that story. So yeah, getting back to your question of like, how does a recent fire affect future flammability? It really depends on the ecosystem. It depends on like, what was the vegetation? Was it grass? Was it brush? Was it mature timber? Was it logged forest? It really varies place to place. So like way different issues in Southern California maybe than from Northern California in the lasting ecological effect or fuel reduction from a single fire. But within a single fire, the severity patterns also affect the kind of future vegetation condition. So we tell those stories using Sentinel. And, sometimes we can get data of where projects got done. So let's just jump into kind of a little story here from 2023 using Google Earth. So in August of 2023, there was a lightning storm that started fires kind of all over California, and especially in northeastern California. So these little flames are kind of taken from a data set that is maintained by the National Fire Center of ignitions. And so it started a bunch of fires, and what we know kind of from history is that when you have a lot of fires start across a wide geographic area, there aren't enough firefighters, there's not enough airplanes to put them all out. So they kind of triage them. So right off the bat, there were some fires that started up in this area, the Klamath Mountains, where we've done a lot of prescribed burning. And we've also done a lot of planning up here for nonprofits and tribes that are looking at kind of the big picture of fire on their landscape. So right off the bat, if we look at the fire history here, we see that these fires here are burning in an area that hasn't had, like these red fires haven't happened for almost 100 years. So talking to friends here in Orleans, they've been concerned that a big fire in this area could threaten their community, because we know that the longer an area goes without burning, the thicker the forests are. So they were concerned when they saw these fires start up here, but because these fires are in the middle of nowhere, which we can see from our structure layer, some people live out here in Orleans, and other than that, like very few people live in this part of the state. So when you look at where you have new starts versus where you've got structures, the firefighters go where the structures are. And so these fires didn't get any firefighting resources for the first couple days. And then they kind of decided like, hey, we're not going to do much to fight these. They started on top of the ridge. They're burning with beneficial fire effects. The climate was good. The fuel moistures were not really dry. We weren't in critical fire spread conditions. So they let the fires burn. And they kind of, over the course of, a couple weeks, they kind of steered these fires a little bit by lighting backfires off of established road systems and by kind of strategically lighting areas. So you can see here on your imagery from 2023, from the fall, you can see the area that ended up burning. But so one of the ways that I help tell the story is that I know a lot of the people that are actually out fighting the fire. I've worked a lot in this area, so I have friends and I can call and say like, hey, what are you guys going to do with this one? What are you going to do with that one? What's the strategy? What resources do you have? I can look online and see like the incident action plans for each day of like what the resources are for each fire. And so Google Earth is the place I can package all of that. And so I'm getting fire perimeter data from the National Fire Center. I'm also more recently CAL FIRE, California OES. They're funding planes that fly fires several times a day, and that's called the Fire Risk Program. I get those as network link KMLs. That's another thing that's really important for me is having a network link. And so I made a list. I haven't been using the online version of Earth at all because it just doesn't do anything that I need. Like it really does very little of what I need it to do. So I need network KMLs. I need to be able to work locally with large data sets. It doesn't have vertical exaggeration. I need to be able to bulk symbolize stuff. I need to be able to grab quickly a perimeter from a network KML and recolor it to be red with a clear background. But that KML that I'm loading sometimes has 30 different polygons, and so I can't go through and like symbolize each one of those. I need GeoTIFF support so I can load external imagery. I need to be able to digitize quickly and organize folders quickly. So right now the online version doesn't do any of that for me. So what I need in an online version is I need everything that's in Google Earth Pro. Like there's very little in Google Earth Pro that I don't use. There's ways that we can improve the symbology in Google Earth Pro. But right now, like I've evolved a workflow where it does everything I need. Anyway, so this fire, as it progressed, on the lookout, we were kind of just using these daily perimeters to tell the story. And then we got wind that not only were they going to let these fires burn, they were going to connect them all together into one big fire because they saw this opportunity to get ecologically beneficial fire on the ground. They had an open budget with the national government paying for firefighting. And that never happens. Like we never get the money we want to do prescribed burning. So a friend of mine got to go up in a helicopter and like rain flammable ping pong balls basically down onto these ridge lines over the course of several days. And they lit all this on fire on purpose. And this is kind of, a big deal. Like this is kind of radical reimagining of how to fight fire. Because what they did in doing this was they contained these fires that were too kind of steep and rugged to contain directly. So they put together a firing plan. I'm a prescribed fire boss, so I've been working a lot up in this country for a very long time with the tribes and with locals. And let me pull up something here.
While you're pulling that up, question in the chat: why does it help to rain the fireballs down onto the fire?
That's a great question. All right, so this is a prescribed burn that I helped do over in the Klamath Mountains, maybe 2017. And what we do is we light fire in the fall from the tops of the mountains, and the fire backs down the hill in a controlled fashion. And as it's backing, it is consuming dead material. It's burning at a kind of controllable severity, and it's not killing the large trees. And so we're doing this on purpose, right? And so in the Klamath Mountains especially, we've been building a lot of capacity among the local people and among the tribes to use fire for land management, because there's, in this country, at this scale, this far away from civilization, there's just not enough money, not enough resources to log this or to do this any other way. And so what we know from all this work we've done and from the tribes doing this for thousands of years is that fire backing down the mountain under the right conditions is like what we need to have healthy acorns, have healthy elk herds, deer, everything else. And so a lot of the expertise that's been built locally in managing fire has helped people understand that fire is the best tool. And a lot of the work we've done, so that burn that I just showed you was right here above the town of Orleans, burning this hillside. And so through the kind of strategic application of prescribed fire around these really scattered communities, we've built a level of comfort for people to understand fire's place in the landscape and understand the conditions under which it's good. So here in October of 2023, like this is the same time, basically they canceled a prescribed fire training event that was going to happen this week because we burn this time of year because it's the beneficial time to burn. So these fires were uncontained in that they had potential, if we had big winds or something, to keep spreading. But by kind of creating this box of fire lines along the ridge tops and burning off of it, we were able to basically up the scale of prescribed burning, and we ended up with like a 35,000 acre prescribed fire. And so if you look at that, and then you look at the severity maps, we got these really beneficial fire severities. So maximizing the area burned by this fire was actually the best thing ecologically that we could have done as managers. And so this is a story, obviously, that I think we need to tell. This is kind of fits right in the mission. And you can tell by the final footprint of the fire that like the fire burned and then it went out, basically. Like because the conditions were such, it started raining. So a lot of these areas that burned only burned as long as they were lighting it. So back to the question about where I get my perimeters. I load these as KMZs from the National Fire Center. If I can't, like sometimes healthy acorns, yes. So tan oak trees are important food source. Still a ton of people living out here that are native Karuk and Yurok people that still have traditional gathering. They gather acorns and use them to make soup and other food, pancakes. They eat salmon from the river. They eat eels. They pick tan oak mushrooms, which are a great kind of mushroom that grows in the tan oak stands. And so this is Northern California. It's a really interesting part of the state where you've got still remnants of this culture that hasn't been lost. It's been passed down directly. So I've had the opportunity to go out here and burn with these tribal members over the last 20 years. And basically I got invited because I had a company that did incident management, that did GIS. And so the Karuk tribe has a GIS staff. We show up on these prescribed burns and we use GIS to help decide where to do the work and to coordinate the work, just like as if it was a wildfire. So Google Earth is part of our workflow. The people that I send out in the field bring me back GPS like KMLs from Avenza Maps. I use Google Earth to combine those KMLs into a single file that I can turn into a geo database to use to produce maps in Esri products. Anyway, so that's an example of us using. So we made a video about this. We made actually quite a few videos about this for the Lookout, and in those we're doing these kind of live streams that are kind of a map-based tour. So so let's see, 2023 maybe. So we'll end up using this stuff in, we'll do these live streams.
That feeling when you file, fed, and state 100%.
So this is kind of what the Lookout is me using Google Earth. In this case, I'm talking with a friend of mine who's local. And
active dry fuel bed in that meadow. Yeah, so this is the night before last. I got a call around
can you guys hear the
10:30 from
audio?
a landowner who was seeing the fire
We can't.
approach their house
We cannot.
on
All right. Well, I think
their door cam.
the thing to
They
say
were
about
2
it is
hours.
just that the locals up here are savvy, and the locals are using Google Earth Pro along with the infrared data to it shows up on their Facebook. They've got like a Facebook page that talks about fire issues, and there's folks up there that have learned how to like find the KMLs, load them, make maps, and then people talk about it. And so in this case, it kind of frustrates the firefighters because the locals have strong opinions on how things should get done. And they'll come to the meeting and they'll say, like, we don't think you should fire that ridge because you tried that in 2017 and it didn't work. Or in this case, this fire the same year was burning above the town of Orleans, and they didn't want retardant dropped on these ridge lines because after the fires that happened here in 2006, they had unsafe levels of phosphorus and ammonia in their drinking water because this is the drinking water watershed for all the people who live here. And so I think you guys who work on this program should know that like people are using it in all sorts of amazing ways. I'm sure you know that, but like that it's kind of a keystone of people's spatial awareness in driving this community-based discussion around how to fight fires. And they're pushing back and saying, no, why don't you let that burn because it's going to burn into the Butler fire scar. And like, okay, well then where's the Butler fire? Well, this area here burned in 2013. We're not worried about this fire burning all the way up to here because we know the fuel loading is light in here because it's been 10 years since a hot burn. So that's part of what we're trying to do with our coverage is make GIS accessible to people, tell stories. And so these videos that we end up doing are a mishmash of here's the weather forecast, here's the fire severity map, here's how past fires are affecting the vegetation patterns in ways that are going to affect how this fire burns. And then people will say, oh, they're burning up the whole mountain, it's terrible. And you say, well, actually, this is the fire severity imagery that we have, and you can see that like this whole area here was inside the burn, and it underburned. Like there's still trees. It's not like the fire, killed every tree. It's like there were patches where it was hot. And then you say, another thing that is just so incredibly useful about what you guys are providing is the historic imagery. So in here we can look at the imagery and we can say like, oh, the fire burned hot there. And it's like, well, is that the worst thing? Let's look at what it looked like before the fire. And oftentimes the areas that burned hot were a brush field before. And it's like, well, that's chaparral. Chaparral burns hot. Right? So we're like, oh no, this area burned hot. Is that a bad thing? No, it's not. Actually, it just burned up a bunch of brush. Or in this case, one thing that's interesting is that it burned up a bunch of clear cuts. And we can go and so for this particular project, it's like I had a layer of clear cuts that I loaded as a shape file from the Forest Service, right? So the problem is that I end up with hundreds of layers and stuff gets lost. But like these are timber harvest units. This was a timber sale that happened in 1979. And then they planted all these baby trees, and now they're too dense because they didn't thin them, and this forest type hasn't responded well to clear cutting. So if we look at that data and then we look at the fire severity, like, hey, look at these old clear cuts didn't fare so well versus areas that hadn't been clear cut maybe. So it's just another way that we're bringing kind of historic imagery, historic land use, historic forest politics and everything into this conversation, because as we've said, like fire, everything about fire is kind of spatially explicit. And how can we become better land managers? Why did the fire burn hot where it did? What does that have to do with? Every place has this story and so this is why I love your product. Is the historic imagery is so incredibly important. It's like, let's go back to 1998 and see, like, what would it look like when they were logging here? I've been working in this landscape for a really long time. My whole professional career, and I've watched it burn, and I've also had these kind of feelings about what might happen, right? And so, like, where I live here in Chico, and so you guys are just getting the lookout experience here, right? It's just like I'm just going to fly around on Google Earth and talk, and these are the tools how I learned to read the landscape. And so, like, if I can share that and teach other people how to use this stuff, that's great. So I started working in this landscape. This is the landscape above where I live in Chico. This land's all owned by Sierra Pacific Industries, which is the largest private landowner in the country. And so I've got a layer here that is timberland ownership, right? All this yellow is owned by SPI. And you can see that SPI's forest practices involve a lot of clear cutting. That's their whole strategy. And that just started in my career, right? So if you go up above Chico, there's clear cuts everywhere. And another interesting story here for us is that some of this land is in carbon offsets. And so SPI is getting paid to grow carbon on this landscape. Anyway, so when I look at the fire history or the fire severity of, say, the Park Fire, which just burned here, I'm really interested in how, like, the forest management history affects that. I can look at, how historic logging has affected the hydrology here. I can see all their skid roads, everything else. And then I can look at the post-fire imagery and see, like, the severity in these burn patches. Google Earth is right in the middle of how I make sense of all these different threads. So thank you for making it.
Thanks so much for sharing this with us. I know we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm curious maybe if some of the Googlers have questions about your use.
Maybe I'll start with a question. This is sort of just geeking out on one very particular corner of what you were talking about. But I mean, actually, as you're just showing here, bringing in data from Copernicus, do they offer a particular set of visualizations that you then are pulling from? Like if we've been thinking here as you've been talking about ways where we could make it really easy to bring these kinds of visualizations into Earth, but it's scientific multispectral data. It looks like you've got a few ways you view it here. What would be useful to you? What do you use of their capabilities?
Yeah, so they've got feeds. They got like a weekly feed, I think. And so I use the SWIR imagery, which is the shortwave IR. And so, like, in the case of this area I was just talking about, like, looking at the fire severity, they've got these kind of baked in. They've got their kind of natural color. They've got a highlight optimized one. They've got false color. This is, like, from last week of January. So I'll often use, it depends on what I'm looking for. I'll use NDVI if I want to see, like, where there's still surviving green trees. I'll use SWIR if I want to look at the burn severity. And in here, I can just kick out a KMZ and load it straight in. But they do have I've noticed in Caltopo, they've got kind of like a weekly feed. So I'm just going to open up that real quick. And so, like, the area I was just showing you those clear cuts, like, everything out there is killed, right? There's these little patches of surviving forest. And so I use this stuff a lot. I use it a lot also for just kind of before and after comparisons. Like, if you look at the whole northern Sierra Nevada mountains, there's this huge amount of change on the landscape in the last, 10 years. And so, like, things like NDVI really show that well, just because they're, that's kind of their intent. So if you look at this image here, and then you go back, to 2018, like, it looks way different, right? It looks like there's a lot more green back, So those are other things that I think they just make for really good storytelling.
Julian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thanks, Zeke. This was a really helpful and illuminating presentation to see how you're using Google Earth Pro. At one point, you're listing some needs, or rather some gaps that Google Earth Web past EarthPro, and you mentioned I need to work locally with large data sets. And I kind of am hoping that you can expand a little bit on both parts of that. Like, what exactly does it mean for you to work locally? Does it mean that you don't want to be working in a web app at all or on the cloud? And how large of data sets are we talking?
Let me see on the data set size here. Just if I can pull up my fire history layer. Like, I tried to load my fire history layer into Web Pro or online, and it choked. It said there's too many polygons, and it took a long time to load. So I need the ability to have 30,000 features, and I also need the ability to be able to symbolize them in batches. So like if I'm looking at fires from the 1930s and I want to change these all to purple or something, what I like about Google Earth Pro right now is I can just change the style for the whole folder, and then all thousands of them change all at once. And that's something I can't do in the online version. So the symbology, even though it's kind of I'd say clunky in Google, it was built. It hasn't changed much in the last 20, 25 years in Google Earth Pro. So there are things about the symbology tools that aren't great, but the ability to batch kind of handle things like changing colors and everything are super important to me. Other things I need when I say work locally is like, I have these big data sets and I don't want to upload them to the cloud and then wait for them to render and come back to me. So, and timeliness is important in my work because I wake up at like 5 a.m. I gather data for half an hour, I symbolize it all, and then I do a live stream for an hour at 6 a.m. And so I need to be able to it matters if it takes like 30 seconds to load a big KML. Like that's too long for me, really. So does that answer your question?
That does, thanks.
Another thing that is important for me is like the super overlay ability, which so like here's where are we going? During the Palisades fire, a contact at Planet sent me a nice SkySat overlay, I think it was. And so I was able to load that as a GeoTIFF into Google Earth Pro, and it made it into a super overlay. And these are big files, but so for me to be able to do that, then I could tell this story about like the way this fire got fought. You can actually come in on this Maxar imagery that I was able to load straight in as a GeoTIFF, and you say like, look, they really painted the heck out of this with retardant. Like, there's no other way I could tell this story so well as to be able to create like on the fly this imagery. It's amazing imagery that it's like, oh, there's the burnt. How else could you tell a story about this burnt neighborhood without being able to easily add this high resolution imagery? And so, having this kind of super overlay that's several hundred megs, that's important to me. Another thing I don't like about working online is I don't really want to give everyone my data, right? And so, like when I upload something to my Google project, I don't really know whether or not like someone else is I don't know what's gonna happen to it. I feel like this is my property. I'd rather keep it on my computer and use it for my own purposes. I don't really want to put it in the cloud for anyone else. I mean, there's times I do want to share stuff, but other times it's like, no, this is my intellectual property. I've spent time to symbolize and tell the story and create it. So that's important, is being able to, the GeoTIFF support is important. It's a really common way for us. Another thing that was handy about like GeoTIFF is the ability to bring in like, I wanted to bring in a progression map from this so I could talk about that and how the fire had grown. And so I could just like export a TIFF of the progression map and import it as a GeoTIFF. And then, so this is a map that was made by the fire team. And so I can talk about like, hey, the fire started here and then the next day it was here. And that progression tells you a story about, the weather and the fuel availability and everything else. So I think other things that would be useful for me is like the ability to read like ArcGIS REST services, because a lot of data now is being published as REST services. And it's still kind of hard to like necessarily grab a REST service, convert it to KML, bring it in. And so, better integration with GIS would be super helpful for me for, kind of a pro version of anything.
Awesome. Thank you. I know Russell has one more question, but it might be too long. It's over time. So I might have to send that as a follow-up if you're willing to answer questions over email.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think this was enormously helpful for the team. It was really valuable to see how you handle all this data. It was really interesting to learn about all of the different sources from which you get your data and like their different uses, and to see how you kind of navigate your Places panel and manage all of this. So thanks so much for telling us some stories today. And we're going to have to tune into the Lookout, I think, after this to see some more of this storytelling. Thanks so much, Zeke.
Thank you. And please keep Google Earth Pro alive.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Where do we find the stream? I may have missed the video.
The Lookout?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you just search the Lookout YouTube, you'll find it, but I can also share it around.
YouTube live stream.
YouTube, yeah.
Yeah, and we have a regular website too, the lookout.org, which is our archive. And so you can go back in there and we've done lots of different, every time we do a video, we'll usually do a summary. And then you can watch the video on the site and read kind of a breakdown. And if that plugs,
and I
then
can
it's
confirm
hilarious.
Google Earth Pro
There's a new
makes an
development out here.
appearance
Cool.
in I think almost every
Ecology.
video. But I was looking on the site and there's a lot of Google Earth there.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Yeah, you can get a hold of me via the Lookout if you want to talk more directly.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
You.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.